Thank you for joining us for the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance's panel discussion on the legacy of the Treaty of Sèvres in the Eastern Mediterranean. My name is Luke Katsos, EMBCA'S president, and I will be moderating today's panel. A distinguished panel includes author, independent historical researcher Stavros Stavridis, author-writer Lou Ureneck, professor of journalism retired at Boston University, author-writer Stavros Drakoularakos, PhD, editor-in-chief, Center for Mediterranean, Middle East and Islamic Studies, and Professor Ismini, the director of the Modern Greek program in the Department of Classics at Georgetown University. Just a little background on our discussion today. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920, was a peace treaty that was to have concluded World War I between the Allied powers and the Ottoman Empire, a member of the Central Powers in the war. It aimed to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and redistribute its territories, marking a significant turning point in Middle Eastern geopolitics and the decline of Ottoman influence. Negotiated primarily by the Allied powers, including France, Britain, and Italy, the treaty imposed territorial losses on the Ottoman Empire. The treaty recognized the independence of Armenia, Kurdistan, Hejaz, now part of Saudi Arabia, and granted control over Constantinople and the Dardanelles Strait to an international commission. Under the terms of the treaty, furthermore, the mandates of Syria and Lebanon were assigned to France, while Palestine and Iraq were given to Britain. Greece was awarded Eastern Thrace, the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, and the administration of the Smyrna region, which was home at the time to a substantial Hellenic population. The treaty faced, of course, opposition within Turkey, and the unpopularity of the treaty among the Turkish population was a significant factor in its eventual failure. The treaty was perceived as imposed without fair negotiation and as a betrayal by the Ottoman people, who thought that the Sultan, Mehmed VI, had agreed to such stringent terms. The widespread dissatisfaction with the Sultan's acceptance of the treaty further fueled the nationalistic movement and its push for a new, more favorable government. The treaty ended up leading to the Turkish War of Independence, a conflict that lasted from 1919 to 1923. The nationalists, under Kemal, eventually repelled Allied forces and abolished the Sultanate, establishing the Republic of Turkey in 1923. Kemal and his followers led the Turkish War of Independence, and they rejected the Sultan's authority, as we indicated. Internationally, the geopolitical context played a critical role in Kemal's success. The Allies were divided and had competing interests in the region. Britain, France, and Italy, the primary architects of the treaty, had different priorities and were unable to present a united front. And it varied in various degrees. Kemal was actually helped with support from the Soviet Union, Germany, and France, each driven by their own strategic interests. The Soviet Union, for example, was Kemal's most significant international supporter. The Soviets provided the substantial military and financial aid, including weapons, ammunition, and gold, critical for the Turkish forces. This support was part of a broader strategy at the time to prevent the establishment of Western-dominated regimes in former Ottoman territories and to foster socialist revolutions in neighboring countries. Germany, despite its defeat in World War I, also extended support to Kemal and the nationalistic forces. Many German officers who had served in the Ottoman Empire during the war remained in Turkey, offering military expertise and training to the Turkish nationalists. France's support was a little bit more pragmatic and evolved over time. Initially part of the Allied occupation, France faced severe resistance from Turkish forces in Cilicia, and realizing the unsustainability of their position, the French negotiated the Treaty of Ankara in 1921, withdrawing their forces and implicitly recognizing the nationalist movement. This shift aimed to preserve French economic interests and counter British dominance in the area. So there's a lot of things that happened, obviously, relating to this particular treaty that many people don't talk about, but a very important one. Obviously, the treaty and the Turkish War of Independence resulted eventually in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which we also discussed last year, and nullified the territorial gains from Sèvres and mandated also a population exchange between Greece and Turkey, displacing around 1.5 million people. And as Ismini knows, and many of you who have been with us on other panel discussions, it also related to a tremendous Christian genocide within the former Ottoman territories, amounting to about 3.2 million deaths. So with this, I'd like to introduce our panelists for just some brief presentations, and then we'll open up our panel discussion. Our first the panelist that I'm going to introduce is Stavros Stavridis. He was born in Cairo, Egypt, and migrated with his parents to Australia. He has also lived in the United States and holds a master's degree in history from RMIT University. He has taught at university and community college levels, both in Australia and the US. Terry is the author of 4 books and 5 contributing chapters on Greek-Turkish history, genocide, minorities, and historical fiction. His research interests focus for a great degree on the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913, Greece during World War I, the Greek-Turkish War, 1919 to 1923, and wider Middle East history, which are based on primary sources from the British, US, and Australian archives. He currently works as a freelance writer for the National Herald in New York City, writing history and historical fiction. Welcome, Terry, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Louis, for the introduction. Excuse me. It's just after 4 a.m. in the morning here, so I had to get in and sleep a few hours earlier. A very interesting topic, something that we don't normally discuss. We mainly focus on the destruction of Smyrna and the Lausanne Treaty. And I think it was time, at least, to discuss something about the Treaty of Sèvres. As you said, the Treaty of Sèvres was the first attempt by the Allies to impose their peace conditions on the defeated Ottoman Empire. So this is what the Treaty of Sèvres actually looks like from the. This is a British parliamentary paper as such. So could you go please to the one on Smyrna, please? To the next, yeah. So Articles 65 to 83 are what Greece was in charge of Smyrna. And for example, the inhabitants of Smyrna, after a period of years, would be given the opportunity to vote to unite with Greece. And that would have been organized via the League of Nations. And of course, the Turkish flag was going to be flown outside the forts of Smyrna. Now, the next one you can go to is Greece, Articles 84, if you could please. Yeah. Articles 84 is just basically outlining Greece's boundaries with Turkey and Bulgaria. The next one is Cyprus, Articles 115 to 17. Britain would gain complete control of Cyprus as a crown colony, as such, and of course those that were Turkish nationals in the Ottoman Empire would become British nationals. And then we've got the Aegean Islands, which Turkey would renounce all control of and hand them over to Italy. Now, there's another treaty here, the treaty between the Allied powers and Greece over Thrace, but basically here it has to do with the aspect of Alexandroupolis and Bulgaria. It's only a short treaty, this one. And then we've got the next one, the treaty between the principal allied powers and associate powers with Greece, and that has to do with Greece's responsibilities to look after the minorities within its borders. One treaty which I didn't include was like that, and I just remembered it the other day. It's the tripartite agreement. This was a secret treaty between the British, the French, and the Italians to parcel out economic spheres of influence in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, in the end, as you said, Louis, Mustafa Kemal, when he saw the treaty, he said, "This is just a mere piece of paper, and we're going to tear this up," as such. But just going back very quickly, in terms of how the Turkish peace treaty started, it started off when Venizelos announced the Greek territorial claims at Paris on February 3rd and 4th, 1919. And then in response to that, our allied friends set up a Greek territorial committee, which lasted for about 4 or 5 weeks. And then they came to a determination that Greece should be in charge of Smyrna. And then, of course, the Greeks landed, and this is where we get into a lot of trouble. People don't understand this. Greece landed in Smyrna on behalf of the Allies. It wasn't an invasion as in a normal sense of the word. Greece sent troops there on behalf of it was sanctioned by Woodrow Wilson, Georges Clemenceau, and Lloyd George. The Italians had no involvement in this because they had left the conference in April of 1919 because Woodrow Wilson was very disenchanted in the way they were acting over their so-called claims in Asia Minor. Now, fast forward, the Allies then started to get together in February, March 1920 in London to discuss what the Turkish peace treaty would sort of look like, and then finally they sort of put the seal on the treaty at San Remo in April of 1920, and then they basically handed the final treaty to the Turks to have a look at. The Turks didn't like this; they procrastinated, and then the Allies said to them in June, July, sign it or else. And then, of course, we come to August 1920, where it was signed at Sèvres. Now, one of the things that the Allies were hoping for at that time was that the United States would have taken the mandate for parts of Asia Minor. Woodrow Wilson was very keen on that, but at that time, the United States Senate was against that. And so in the end, they asked Woodrow Wilson to arbitrate on the future boundaries of the Armenian Republic. Now, the poor little Armenia Republic did exist, but in the end, it was basically snuffed out by an attack from the Turks, from the Kemalists from the south and the Bolsheviks from the north. And that resulted in the Treaty of Alexandroupolis in December 1920. And then after that, Armenia became a Soviet republic as such. And of course, they promised autonomy to the Kurds. Well, of course, that never happened. But if you look at if you look at, say, this map here, and you're Mustafa Kemal in 1920, you say, oh my God, they've divided my homeland into all these spheres of influence. Well, I'm going to fight this, and that's basically what he did. Now, one of the things that I'd just like to go back to was during the discussions in February, March 1920 in London, the Kemalists actually attacked French positions in Marash, which resulted in over 10,000, 15,000 Armenians being slaughtered. And when that happened, the British occupied strategic positions in Constantinople, and basically said to the Sultan, there was actually a move to try to remove the Sultan and his government from Constantinople to Bursa. But the Indian Muslims, and this is a factor that a lot of people don't give a lot of credit to, but the Indian Muslims actually kept arguing that it's in the interest for the Sultan to remain in Constantinople, because the Indians were also threatening the British in India. So in the end, they did send an Indian delegation to London in March 1920, and they're able to convince Lloyd George that the Sultan should remain there. And finally, in one of the articles that deals with Turkey, the Sultan would remain there. And I think there was a condition which said that if you misbehave, we'll pick you up bag and baggage and send you to Asiatic Turkey. And of course, out of all this, we see the mandates that were created, as you said, in Mesopotamia, which became Iraq. Lebanon and Syria became French mandates, and also Palestine became British, and that's really about it. Now, there's my study. You know, when I did my masters on the Greco-Turkish War, my focus was the two Melbourne newspapers, The Age and the Argus, and for a time, the Australian press was very supportive of the Greek position because of Eleftherios Venizelos. But when the things changed later on in 1920, the Australian press began to change its focus away from supporting Greece to supporting the Turkish position. And the reason why is the Australian government during World War One conducted a secret census to sort of find the attitude of Greeks living here, whether they were Venizelos or Royalist. But the overall majority of about 1,200 Greeks living in Australia were mainly Venizelos. And of course, a lot of Australians thought that Greeks were pro Germany or something, and we do have Greek shops in certain Australian cities having their window fronts smashed because of this. They didn't understand that most of the Greeks were pro-Venizelos. But overall, the Australian press was very, very favourable to the Greek position during the time of the Lausanne discussions. And the Lausanne Treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres, my apologies, is actually deposited in the National Archives of Australia, because the Australian government did sign the Treaty of Sèvres and these other agreements which I mentioned, with the exception of the Treaty of the Tripartite Agreement, which was a secret thing that only affected the big three European powers. And the reason why Australia signed it was because it fought against the Ottoman Empire at Gallipoli, and also too Australians also played their own part in the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War One at Beersheba, which allowed Britain to finally occupy Jerusalem in 1917. Oh, there's so much to this. I could write a book just looking at this map here. As such. But also too, the other thing we need to remember too at this time that that the Italians wanted Smyrna as well, because that had been promised to them during World War One, as such. But in the end, the Anglo-French distrusted the Italians, because they sort of saw them as the new kid on the block, as such. And as long as Venizelos was in power, Britain and France tended to be supportive of Greece. But once Venizelos lost the election of November 1920, well, that really began the end, in my mind, on the long haul to the loss of Asia Minor. And to tell you the truth, this has nothing to do with my presentation. I hate monkeys. I hate monkeys because it was a monkey bite that resulted in the death of King Alexander and the return of the royalist as such. That's really about it that I could say, and we'll just open it up later on to the panel, and we can have our own discussion on these issues.
Thank you so much, Terry. And Ismini, I'm sure will mention something about it, but I think what was important in the discussion, among many of the good things that you said, was the fact that part of the reason why Greece went and sent some people into Smyrna was that the rest of the allies didn't want Italy to go into it. And that's the most unfortunate thing that took place. But again, Ismini, I think, will cover that. Our next presenter is Lou Ureneck. Lou is a writer and retired professor who has written 3 books and now working on the 4th. He has taught in professional settings as a writing coach for media and research organizations. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, International Herald Tribune, Boston Globe, Neiman Reports, and Field and Stream. Lou was editor of the Portland Press Herald and a senior editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. As a professor, he was a Neiman Fellow and editor-in-residence at Harvard University. As a Fulbright senior specialist, he taught at the National University in Kiev. He was the Eleftherios Venizelos Chair in Modern Greek Studies at the American College of Greece in Athens, and has been inducted into the Maine Journalist Hall of Fame. His book, Backcast, won the National Outdoor Book Award for Literary Merit in 2007. He has received the Hellenic Heritage Award, and the New England Academy of Journalists named him a recipient of the Yankee Quill Award, New England's highest individual award for journalism. He has been a professor of journalism at Boston University from 2004 until recently, and was the chairman of the department of Boston University from 2006 to 2010. Lou, thank you for being with us today. And I'm glad we got you back from Greece so you could be on this panel.
Lou, thanks for having me. And it's great to be together again on Zoom with all of our friends who've had these panel discussions. So thanks to everybody. And Terry, thank you for that excellent presentation. I learned quite a bit from you in that presentation. So thank you. So I'm going to sort of provide an interpretive sense of the legacy of Sèvres here. And I think Terry has hit on a lot of the facts and the dates and so forth. And I'm going to try to sort of bring the camera back a bit and evaluate it. It seems to me the legacy of Sèvres is the lesson that war and diplomacy cannot be based on weakness and wishful thinking. Sèvres was an illusion. The Philhellenism of Lloyd George and the brilliance and vision of Venizelos were soon to meet the realities of a tough regional war and the exhaustion of post-war Britain and the brilliance and anti-Greek state of mind of another formidable man, Mustafa Kemal. Consider what happened between the signing of the Sèvres Treaty and the end of the Greek-Turkish War from 1920 to 1922. In 1920, Turkey was an occupied nation. It was a defeated combatant in World War I, an ally of Germany. It had signed an armistice in 1919 that granted allies power over post-war affairs in the country. In other words, Turkey was not unlike Germany and Austria and Hungary. It was defeated and it was prostrate, all of which seemed justified at the time. Bear in mind that the Turks had pulled Russia into the war initially and caused the transfer of nearly a third of Allied forces from Europe into the Middle Eastern campaign, thereby extending the duration of the war. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops became casualties as a consequence of Turkish actions. In other words, from the Allied perspective, Turkey was a bad actor and needed to be punished for this and other crimes. It's also worth bearing in mind that France, Britain, and Russia had the division of Turkey on its agenda from long, before the war actually took place, as Terry has noted. The Greek-Turkish War, that is, and also World War I. By the summer of 1922, the situation was totally reversed. The Turkish Nationalist Army was poised to push the Greeks from Asia Minor and possibly to go to war directly with Britain. Consider the parallel to Germany and the Versailles Treaty. What was happening in Asia Minor? It's as if a German general had rejected Berlin's acceptance of the terms at Versailles, formed a populist army in Bavaria, and marched against French forces occupying the Rhineland. This is what was happening in Asia Minor. So I see Sèvres as a kind of signpost of the illusion under which Britain, France, and Greece were operating. What illusion? That Britain and France could divide up the oil fields and Greece would prevail in a war against Turkish nationalism. Reality finally sunk in with the evacuation of Greek troops in September of 1922, the crisis at Chanak, and the eventual adoption of the Lausanne Treaty. Now, there were troubling markers between the two treaties. And by the way, as all of our panelists know, Sèvres was never fully ratified by the Greeks, even though it was so favorable to the Greeks. I'll mention three of these markers in that interim time period. The first is the looseness with which Britain allowed the rearmament of Turkey under Kemal. Unbelievable. Second, the British failure to prosecute Turkish war criminals in this period. And the inability of Greeks, thirdly, the inability of Greeks to maintain national unity in time of war. I think we can all agree that the return of Constantine was a folly and an unmitigated disaster for the Greek cause. Would the result have been different if Venizelos had remained in power? We can't know if he would have conducted the war differently. Perhaps he would have been less aggressive than Constantine. And he probably would have managed British relations much differently. In any event, he was up against much bigger international forces, and he also may not have prevailed. So we're here to evaluate the Sèvres Treaty and not the Lausanne Treaty, but I will say that views of the Lausanne Treaty tend to divide along the lines of whether one sees it as a settlement of the Greek-Turkish War or a settlement of World War I. The two are blended, of course, but the indictments that flow from each are very different. So another lesson or legacy of Sèvres is this, and I'm thinking especially of Britain in this regard, which was the principal supporter of the Greek war against Turkey in the beginning, and the primary motivator, along with Wilson, but principally Turkey of Greece occupying Smyrna in May of 1919. So the lesson, it seems to me, is this. In democracy, there needs to be a consensus to enter a war, a consensus to wage a war, and a consensus to settle a war. The first, entering the war, is by far the easiest. The first only takes outrage. The second, conducting the war, takes strength and leadership. The third, which is the actual settlement of war and the war claims, takes persistence, patience, and forceful diplomacy, all of which the Allies could not muster at the end. So I'll end there, Lou.
Very interesting. Thank you, Luz. Thank you so much for that. Our next presenter is Stavros Drakoularakos, PhD. Stavros is a PhD in political science and history, serves as the editor-in-chief at the Center for the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Islamic Studies. He has taught at the University of Macedonia, the University of the Peloponnese, and the Hellenic National Defense College while conducting research at the Center for Religious Pluralism in the Middle East, and the European Council on Foreign Relations. His published work includes Turkey and Israel in the Middle East, from the Cold War to the Arab Spring, Turkey and Erdogan Rising, quote, Lassane Syndrome, Digest of Middle East Studies, Middle Eastern Christianity in Syria and Iraq, at the epicenter of the rise of the Islamic State, in Rousseau's From Pluralism to Extinction, Perspectives and Challenges for Christians in the Middle East. And his research focuses on Turkish-Israeli relations, Middle Eastern foreign policy, and religious pluralism in the MENA and Mediterranean regions. Welcome, Stavros, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be in the presence of such an esteemed panel. I will try my best to give as brief a presentation as I can, so that we can open up the topic for discussion. In contrast to the previous very extremely interesting presentations, my focus on the Sèvres Treaty will be in the decades following its signing. And it's going to be on the side of Turkey, especially what's happening within Turkish society, how the Sèvres Treaty was instrumentalized in order to, some say, control Turkish society. So I'm going to give a very brief context on the perception of the Sèvres Treaty when it was signed by the Sultan in the first years after 1920. Clemenceau was famously credited as saying that the Sèvres Treaty was as fragile as the porcelain that is made in the Parisian suburb named Sèvres. Concurrently, as was previously mentioned, the Turkish independence war started between 1999 until 1943. The independence war was based on the final ruling of the last Ottoman Parliament in 1918, which said which territorial borders are allowed in the future Turkish state that will come after World War I. So, because the Sèvres Treaty potentially gave way to Great Kurdistan, Great Armenia, went to great effects for the great idea. It was seen within Turkey and naturally by Mustafa Kemal, as going into Turkish heartland, what's considered Turkish heartland. So, to that effect, the Lausanne Treaty of 1923 was seen as a great victory, a great war victory by Kemal, as well as a great victory within the realm of negotiation. And at least within Turkey, it was not viewed as a peace treaty, as the previous ones, as the Parisian Treaty or the Saint-Germain Treaty or the Trianon Treaty. It was seen as an agreement for the future Turkish state, for what the future Turkish state, the current Turkish state, has as borders. And in a way, it cemented the successor status state of Turkey following the Ottoman Empire. So, my presentation will focus on what has been called from political sciences as the Sèvres syndrome in Turkish politics. The Sèvres syndrome materialized after 1950. Between 1950 and 1980 was the golden period, let's say, of the Sèvres syndrome. It was based on a very specific perception, with regard to the Sèvres Treaty. It said that, look, the Allied powers, foreign powers, the Western powers mainly, regardless if we're talking about Greece or Kurdistan or Armenia or whatever, the foreign powers are trying to dismember Turkey. And we have the proof. The proof is within the Sèvres Treaty. They tried to dismember us, and Mustafa Kemal, sorry, I don't know if you hear, there's a bike starting up. And Mustafa Kemal saved us. He managed to stop the Western powers from diminishing what Turkey should be. So after the 1950s, when, by the way, we have now a multi-party system in Turkey, it has opened up to future socialists and other parties. Now, Turkey is within the Cold War. So within the realm of the Cold War, there are a lot of conspiracies going on, and every society is weak towards conspiracy theories. That's not limited to Turkey. That's also in Greece, France, the US, everywhere. But in the case of Turkey, conspiracy theories took a toll on society and were used by political powers to get a handle on the population, which means that we had the Cold War, we had the CIA. All conspiracy theories in Turkey were nourished by international events, as they are now today. But that's something for afterwards. The Watergate scandal, the possibility of a third world war, CIA interventions internationally, the presence of the US in the Middle East, first Britain and then afterwards the US. So the idea is that since Western powers were trying to dismember Turkey in the past, to limit Turkey in the past, it stands to reason that they're going to keep on doing it. And so how would they do it is the question that the conspiracy theory asks. The answer is through agents within Turkish territory. And which are these agents? These agents are whatever suits each government at a specific time period. They could be Kurds, they could be Greek Orthodox, they could be Christians in general, Armenians, they could be Jews, anything that suits the needs of the moment. So that's why the Sèvres syndrome, I like to call it as a utility player to get a basketball term in a way. It can play every position, and it is a reliable player. So if we're talking about the 1960s and 1970s, we're mainly talking about the agents are the Greeks, the agents are the Armenians. If we're talking about 1980s and early 1990s, we're talking about the Kurds, because that's what's going on in Turkey. That's what's in the Turkish zeitgeist at the time. And because of the fact that 2 centuries ago, there was another conspiracy theory going on, that helped cement the Sèvres syndrome in Turkish politics. The previous conspiracy theory in the 18th and 19th century, which raged on in the 20th century, is the Donme conspiracy in Turkey. The Donme conspiracy was based on the idea that Jews in the Ottoman Empire switched religions and became Muslims, but stayed as covert Jews, let's say, in order to climb the higher echelons of Turkish politics. And the conspiracy theory says that now those covert Jews are taking all the decisions in Turkish, in Turkish foreign policy as agents of foreign powers. So basically, the Sèvres syndrome became a filter through Turkish society could view reality. Everything was viewed through this filter. And let's not forget that for every conspiracy to be successful, it needs to take root in some concrete reality. And the concrete reality was that in the previous century, and especially in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was always between foreign power interests, whether we're talking about Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, Britain. It was always considered by Turkish society and Ottoman society at the time that it was stuck between their antagonisms. And they viewed that the same thing was happening during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And let's not forget that the 19th century gave way for the rise of ethnic nationalism, which was the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire, with the Greek Revolution and the Bulgarian, Romanian, etc., Serbian irredentism. One major aspect of the Sèvres syndrome is its versatility. Because when someone says that the threat is this guy or this community, the threat is vague. You're not describing it completely. So the vaguer the threat is, the easier it is for it to grow and self-sustain. If we're talking about Greeks during the 19th and 20th century in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, at least until 1923, they were viewed as agents, as British agents. Even if they weren't afterwards, they were still viewed that way. That's why when the coup happened in 2016, the following day of the coup, the first conspiracy theory that gave way to Turkish rags, let's say, was that Patriarch Bartholomew was behind the coup. It was like an instinct to target those communities, whether it is the Greek one or the Armenian one, or Jews, of course. So, however, the Sèvres syndrome itself was basically retired in the 1990s because the Cold War had ended. Turkey was trying to mend relations with Israel. We had the golden age of Turkish-Israeli relations. And there was also the European accession negotiation process. However, and I don't know how much time I have left, Mr. Katsos.
No, continue. This is very interesting.
Okay. So the Sèvres syndrome was retired, but Erdogan came along in 2002, 2003, basically. Because in 2002, the AKP won the elections, but Erdogan was not yet prime minister. Gül was the prime minister, and he became prime minister in 2003 when he could get political office again. We have what I like to coin the Lausanne syndrome, which I like to say that it's the refurbished legacy of the Sèvres syndrome, because we see different things in the midst of the antagonism between the Erdogan legacy and the Kemalist legacy. We see that the Lausanne Treaty, that was previously seen as the most important treaty with regard to modern-day Turkey, now needs to be potentially revised, as Erdogan said when he came to Greece in 2017. It could stand to be revised. That's what he said, as every treaty should be. So when someone antagonizes the previous most important figurehead of the state, it needs to put a dent on his greatest achievements, on what is seen as his greatest achievements. So, but the Lausanne syndrome is not limited to that. The Lausanne syndrome is seen as a continuation of the Sèvres Treaty, of the Sèvres syndrome, but it has a different after effect. Whereas the Sèvres syndrome was limited to domestic policy. It was a means to control the population and to say that, look, what's happening is because of those foreign agents that are within our soil. Now, it also has a foreign aspect, because those foreign agents are not limited to communities or minorities. They are also neighboring states that are trying to dismember Turkey. We're talking about Israel. We're talking about Syria, perhaps Iraq. It depends on what suits the head of state at the specific time period. So, and it's not that Erdogan woke up one day and said, look, I'm gonna destroy the Lausanne Treaty or bring back something that looks like the Sèvres syndrome. It's that a lot of things were happening within Turkey. We had the re-emergence of the fight with the PKK, which had stopped since the early 2000s. In 2015, we have the re-emergence of the fight of the PKK, with the PKK. We have the downgrade of Turkish-Israeli relations after the Mavi Marmara incident. We have the Gezi Park protests in 2013. And naturally, we have the failed coup of July 15, 2016. And within this context, who are the foreign agents? Everyone. Kurds, Greeks, Jews, Armenians, not so much, but we'll see in the near future. They're always there for the taking with regard to Turkish policy. And we have the mastermind. The mastermind is something that Erdogan has called out, which is some unknown entity that is trying to limit, dismember, whatever, Turkey. And the mastermind controls Greece, controls France, controls the US, controls anyone who could pose a threat to Turkey. And what's extremely interesting about all of this backwards connection with the Sèvres syndrome is that Erdogan has declared a second war of independence in 2016 as a continuation of the first war of independence of Kemal. So what Erdogan is basically saying is that, you know, that financial crisis that's happening, that's crippling Turkey? Foreign agents, masterminds. You know those Kurds that keep doing terrorist attacks? Masterminds. They're foreign agents themselves. Let's not forget about his main political opponents within Turkey, leaving aside minorities. It's well known that after targeting Bartholomew in 2016, the second day, the main architect of the failed coup was supposed to be Fethullah Gülen, which was a previous partner of Erdogan. He was abroad, he's living in the United States, he's been self-exiled since the 1980s, but he was building a network for Turkey abroad, in the Balkans, in Europe. And basically, one of the main things, and I'm going to close with this, one of the main things that Gülen did back in the day within Turkey was to build schools that prepared students for the military, for medical school, for the diplomatic corps exam, whatever you might imagine. So that meant that those schools in the 1980s and 90s led to students that emerged within, and the judicial system mainly, let's not forget about that. They rose within the ranks of Turkish high society, and now could be used by Erdogan. And that's what happened in the 2000s. That's why we saw many trials against Kemalist figureheads. So when, after the 2010s, Erdogan had basically gotten rid of the Kemalist element in Turkey. Now he needed to be the only one on board, in control of Turkey. So he wanted to get rid of the Gülenist influence. So that's why the failed coup was attributed to Gülen, to supporters of Gülen. And because of the whole Lausanne syndrome predicament, we see also the rise of the blue homeland, Mavi Vatan, in Turkish foreign policy, which says that the Lausanne Treaty was very restrictive of Turkish interests. Mavi Vatan, the blue homeland, shows the true range of what should be within Turkish territorial sovereignty. That's that for me. I think I overdid it.
It's okay, Stavros. I'm still thinking about who the mastermind is. I'm trying to figure that one out.
No one knows. And one last thing, it's the mastermind theory is really based on what is called the hero syndrome. The hero syndrome, doctors or policemen. The hero syndrome is someone who creates a situation and he only has the keys to solve it. And he presents himself as the one who holds the keys to solve it. So it's very interesting when you're saying the mastermind and you're not defining him, you're just saying these are his agents. You're the only one who can say, and that's how I beat him. Who knows who he is?
Yeah. Stavros, thank you for that. Ismini Lam is our next presenter. She's the director of Modern Greek Studies program and an associate teaching professor at Georgetown University, home of the oldest sustained modern Greek program in America. She has been teaching and promoting Hellenic studies for over 30 years. Ismini loves sharing the continuity of Hellenic civilization from antiquity to the present with students of all ages by offering courses on Hellenic history, language and culture, and by hosting a variety of cultural events in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. She is the co-author of The Gentle American, George Horton's Odyssey and his true account of the Smyrna catastrophe. This volume is the authorized biography of George Horton, the American Philhellene, classicist, poet, best-selling author, diplomat, ethnographer, and humanitarian. The Horton biography will be coming out in the Hellenic language translation next year in 2025. Ismini speaks and writes on Greek history, culture, and current events frequently. She is a former C.S. Lewis Fellow, a Doyle Fellow, and has held multiple leadership positions in civic organizations. She has published widely, including in the Journal of American Diplomacy, the Mediterranean Quarterly, the New European, Efemeri, and the National Herald. Welcome, Ismini, and welcome coming back from Greece and being in our capital.
Well, thank you very much, Lou, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you to all my co-panelists for such illuminating presentations. Thank you very much. Well, as you can imagine, or perhaps expect, my perspective on the Treaty of Sèvres is largely informed by extensive research for the biography of George Horton. In case you don't know him, he was the American diplomat in Smyrna in 1922 and was also an expert on the Ottoman Empire. Horton would tell us that the Treaty of Sèvres was superior to its successor, the Treaty of Lausanne, for one critically important reason. It punished rather than rewarded genocide. Peace treaties are complex, but I think we can judge their overall merits three ways. First, did they further the interest of the signatories? Two, did they contribute to regional peace and prosperity? And three, did they advance the cause of humanity? Well, most believe the World War I treaties failed in all these respects, primarily because they sowed the seeds for an even more destructive global conflict, World War II. Well, the World War I treaties are typically judged to have been too harsh. They imposed onerous financial reparations and territorial concessions that contributed to the rise of Hitler. Specifically, with regards to the Sèvres Treaty, I believe most historians argue the Lausanne Treaty better served the interest of the signatories, the region, and indeed the world. But I am going to argue the opposite. First, I must correct some widespread historical misconceptions, chief among those, as you heard me saying before, and if you read the book, you'll recognize them perhaps, is the notion that the post-World War I fighting in Anatolia was a Greco-Turkish war and or Turkish War of Independence. I will tell you what you can call it in the end if you want or during discussion. Those terms are actually misnomers. The fighting was really a continuation of World War I, and again, we talk extensively about that in our book, as George Horton himself argued. Modern historians are beginning to agree with Horton on this point, and there are multiple reasons for doing so. First of all, the fighting was not about irreconcilable differences between Greece and Turkey, and those two countries never declared war on one another. Greece provided the most troops at the time, but still British, French, and Armenian forces also fought the nationalists. Further, the British, French, and Italian forces that occupied Asia Minor before Greek forces arrived were still in Constantinople after Greek forces left. Even more to the point, the major decisions about how to manage the Turkish nationalists were made by Britain and France with acquiescence from the other allies. Allied leaders dispatched forces, authorized major military operations, Greek included, and prohibited others. Neither was the conflict a Turkish war of independence. Sorry, the Treaty of Sèvres already guaranteed Turkish independence. Mustafa Kemal's nationalists were fighting for something else, more land and a religiously homogeneous population. The Sèvres Peace Treaty gave Turkey the vast bulk of Asia Minor, but the nationalists wanted more. Kemal himself promised he would, and I quote him, establish the borders of the Turkish Republic according to the degree of our power and our strength, which he did. The nationalists also insisted on eliminating Turkish Christian minorities, as their slogan, Turkey for the Turks, suggested. They accomplished that too, killing between 1.5 and 2.5 million Christians and forcing the rest to flee. Incredibly, the nationalists were still killing and displacing the Anatolia Christians during, I repeat, during the 7 months they negotiated the Lausanne Treaty with the Allies. Another widespread misconception is that the arrival of Greek forces in May 1919 at the behest of Allied leaders precipitated the conflict. As historians now argue, Kemal and his nationalists began resisting the armistice agreement as soon as it was signed. They stockpiled weapons, formed resistance organizations, and attacked Christian villages, among other things, all in violation of the armistice and before Greek forces arrived. Another critical point is that Kemal's victory was anything but inevitable. Historians, sometimes guilty of hindsight bias, tend to describe Turkish resistance and the attendant genocides as inevitable and beyond the control of the Allies. That is false. Small, impoverished Greece almost defeated Kemal by itself. As Horton knew, the Allies could easily have prevailed if they had remained unified, but instead they squabbled, and the Italians, French, and Russians, as we heard earlier, switched sides and supported Kemal with money, weapons, and intelligence. After correcting these historical misconceptions, we can better see why the Lausanne Treaty was a disaster for the world, the region, and the signatories, and arguably even for Turkey. Taking this last point first, it is clear the nationalists got what they wanted and even more. However, Turkey paid a big price that is seldom recognized. As Horton argued, Kemal's vision of a religiously homogeneous nation doomed the possibility of a diverse, multi-ethnic Turkey with civil liberties where truth and the ability to speak it are protected. Within 2 years of the Lausanne Treaty signing, Kemal secured a one-man rule by eliminating his opponents. This was a great misfortune for Turkey and its citizens. The real war of Turkish liberty is ongoing, and with Erdogan in power, it is all but lost. Neither did the Lausanne Treaty bring about regional peace. Kemal continued his policy of persecuting minorities, and other countries began to emulate his example. In fact, polling in the Middle East demonstrates that the more homogeneously Muslim the population is, the more support there is for extremism. In the century since Kemal's victory, his example of persecuting Christian minorities has been emulated. As populations in the region have reduced their Christian minorities, they have become more supportive of extremism and conflict. Last, and more importantly, I think, the Lausanne Treaty was a disaster for humanity. In 1918, former American President Theodore Roosevelt argued that, quote, "The Armenian massacre was the greatest crime of the war, and the failure to act against Turkey is to condone it." He believed the US failure to declare war on Turkey proved that President Wilson's promise to make the world safe for democracy was just insincere rhetoric. The failure to deal radically with the Turkish horror, Roosevelt said, means that all talk of guaranteeing the future peace of the world is mischievous nonsense, end of quote. Roosevelt was right. During the war, the Allies promised to hold Ottoman officials personally accountable for their crimes against humanity and to make them pay a heavy price collectively after the war. Well, the Treaty of Sèvres fulfilled that promise, severely punishing Turkey for genocide. It dismantled the Ottoman Empire, granted the Armenians a homeland, gave Christian minorities equal rights, prosecuted war criminals, and so on. The Treaty of Lausanne did the opposite by holding no one accountable and rewarding Turkey with recognition, commercial relations, and territorial concessions. After World War I, Germans were astounded that the Turkish nationalists, with just a little more resistance and persistence, not only defeated the Allies and wiped out their supposed eternal enemies, but were rewarded for doing so with treaties of commerce and friendship. As German scholar and Nazi expert Robert Gerwarth notes in his milestone book, The Vanquished, and I quote him, "Few politicians observed the developments in Anatolia between 1918 and 1923 with greater interest than Adolf Hitler, who would later profess that in the aftermath of the Great War, he and Mussolini had looked up to Mustafa Kemal as a model of how defiance and willpower could triumph over Western aggression." Hitler not only admired Kemal's uncompromising resistance to Allied pressure, but also sought to imitate his means of constructing a radically secular, nationalist, and ethnically homogeneous nation-state after a crushing military defeat, end of quote. Thus, during World War II, the Nazis emulated the Turkish model of genocide. They disarmed the Jews and other undesirables, used propaganda to stigmatize them as dangerous outsiders, rounded them up, confiscated their property, deported them away from population centers so their true fate could be better hidden, and then mass murdered them. The Lausanne Treaty also enshrined the legitimacy of mass population transfers as a horrifically unjust and brutal process. Sean McMeekin gets a lot of things wrong in his popular book, The Ottoman Endgame, but even he acknowledges this point, writing, and I quote him, "The principle of collective population transfer decreed at Lausanne redounded on all through the 20th century, most notoriously in the population exchanges negotiated by Hitler and Stalin between 1939 and 1941. Stalin's deportation of Crimean Tatars and of Chechen and other Circassian Muslims in 1944, the mass expulsion of German nationals by Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania after the Second World War, the India-Pakistan partition in 1948, and the mutual mass expulsion of Arabs from Israel and Jews from Arab countries, which followed the Arab-Israeli War that same year." End of quote. McMeekin went on to cite other examples of what he calls the Lausanne precedent, not syndrome, precedent, demonstrating its impact is still felt today. For example, Putin justifies his war against the Ukraine based on ethnic homogeneity. We could also note that the world continues to reward China with recognition, trade, and commercial ties, despite its attempt to create perfect national, ethnic, and religious homogeneity by mass persecution of millions of Uyghurs and other minorities. With that, I will conclude my presentation with this summary statement. The Sèvres Treaty, however flawed it might have been in some respects, it was infinitely better than its replacement, the Lausanne Treaty, for the simple reason that it punished rather than rewarded crimes against humanity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ismini. Can we just, I mean, we'll open it up now. Anyone can speak, ask questions, etc., based on the other speakers. But Ismini, Lou, whoever, can we just go over the scenario of the so-called, just a little bit more in depth, of the so-called Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922, because that's the way it's always projected in Turkey, as the speakers have mentioned, and also in Greece and just internationally. Everybody just talks about this war. Can we just go a little bit in depth, and this is anybody, about what it really was? And as was indicated here, you know, many people feel, you know, World War I ended in, 1918, you know, and that was the end of the war, etc. And everybody forgets, but you didn't, as everybody mentioned today, when did World War I actually end? And it certainly didn't end in 1918, and it certainly didn't end in 1922, 1923. Can you just go a little bit in depth? Because this to me is an extremely important thing between, in my opinion, the two populations, not only the Greek population, but also the Turkish population. Anyone?
Well, it certainly ended in 1923, according to the most recent scholarship. I have just a couple of books here, of course, The Vanquished that I mentioned, as well as the Ottoman Endgame. And there are a number of other scholars and books that talk more and more that it ended in 1923. And I'm sure there are a lot of reasons, and I hope our co-panelists will perhaps share some, that it has been called for, like the Greco-Turkish War and the War of Independence for Turkey for so long. We have easily and perhaps a little bit lazily accepted it. But what I would say perhaps is part of a strategic deception on the part of Turkey, which is very good at using propaganda to its advantage, and that we see today happening with Hamas. You know, of my work comparing the two in my articles and presentations on that, is like they're fighting for freedom, right? Well, freedom from what? They were already given most of Anatolia. And again, you look at Hamas and the Palestinians, freedom from what? In 2005, they were given Gaza and it was free. Like the Turks, they really want more territory. They share in those goals, and they want to have homogeneity, get rid of the Jews, just like the Turks wanted to get rid of the minorities, being Greeks, Armenians, Syriacs, and so on. So I think we need to make an effort and call it an allied peace enforcement, and not fall into the trap of what has been mistakenly called for such a long time.
But was the deception also not only obviously by Turkey, etc., by the Turkish representatives, but wasn't the deception also by the West? In other words, wasn't the deception also by the British, by the French, etc., and sort of like made the Greeks and the Turks were fighting their own war. It has nothing to do with us. Well, we're not involved in this particular scenario. Or am I wrong?
I think you're wrong.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me acknowledge Ismini's expertise in this area, and I agree with a lot of what she's saying. But I think it was both the end of World War I and also a Greek-Turkish war. Let's remember that it began with a Greek landing to secure Smyrna and its environs. That was the idea. And the idea was, based on the Sèvres Treaty, that there would be a plebiscite in 5 years to decide whether this area, let's call it Greater Smyrna, was to be a Greek territory or a Turkish territory. So that is one of the steps that would suggest this was part of ending World War I, right? Part of the peace negotiations. But what happened subsequently went way beyond a Smyrna mandate. The Greeks went as far as the Sakarya River. King Constantine went to Asia Minor, rode a horse, carried a cross, and talked about taking Constantinople. So at that point, it's a Greek war. It's not a British war, okay? So I think what began as mismanagement toward the end of the war, World War I, in 1919, 1920, evolved, maybe Greek hubris, I'm not sure what, but evolved into a Greek and Turkish conflict that raised new issues that hadn't existed in 1919. I'm also going to disagree with Ismini about her views on the Sèvres Treaty. Terry put up a really interesting picture of Turkey, and it showed the various zones of influence as seen by England and France and Russia, by the way, early on had the same kind of view of Turkey. And what that reminded me of is the butcher's schematic of the pig. The pig is, there's the shoulder, there's the rump, there's this, there's that. The country was envisioned as a place where these colonial powers could take pieces and transplant for purposes of trade and oil and whatever, their own authority. So Stavros #2, when talking about the Sèvres syndrome, I think there's a certain degree of force to that. I mean, the Turks weren't making this up. They were seeing the world through the lens as it was presented by Russia, France, and England in 1919. So I think, and on the third point, and then I'll stop, and Ismini, please bear with me. I think it's impossible. I mean, I shouldn't say impossible. It's highly unlikely that Greece, once it had moved beyond the environs of Smyrna, could have prevailed in that war. There was economic catastrophe in Greece. I mean, the currency was worthless. They were tearing, drachmas in half, trying to balance their budget. The country had been at war. Many of those soldiers in Asia Minor had been at war for 10 years. They had fought in the Balkan Wars, and then they had come to Asia Minor. The country, Greece was a poor country, and it was exhausted. And it was fighting a bigger population on its home turf. And it seems to me very unlikely that it would have prevailed. I'm not a military expert, but I think reason suggests, by virtue of armaments, wealth, soldiers, and fatigue, it's unlikely that Greece would have prevailed in a wider war.
Yeah, but Lou, weren't they basically abandoned by the so-called allies? I mean, am I wrong on this? In other words, I agree with you. They should not have gone.
You're not wrong, but you're not being realistic. And here's why I say that. Britain was, Europe was devastated by the war. Europe did not have a stomach for continuing World War I. Britain had its own economic problems. So there's that. It was unwilling. Well, there were sort of several forces at work, but there was a powerful economic reason for England not to recommit to new fighting. There were other reasons as well. The other thing is, you have to remember that the Greeks brought back a pro-German king to lead its nation, and that was an insult to the Allies. Why Greeks did that, there are all sorts of reasons, and we can talk about, why those parliamentary elections went the way they did. But strategically, from a geopolitical perspective, it was a disaster. And so the Greeks were asking Britain to support a pro-German king who's riding horseback with a cross in Asia Minor, talking about taking Constantinople. It was not going to wash.
Lou, we're not disagreeing, but let me ask you a question. Who asked let's say the Greeks to go into Smyrna? Who asked them?
The British and the Americans. But let's not remember that Venizelos was a sly operator, right? He didn't do it against his will. The Greeks didn't say, "Oh, big sacrifice, we're going to go to Smyrna." And the Greeks wanted to be at Smyrna. And Venizelos had spent a lot of time at Versailles persuading Lloyd George and Wilson that the Greeks ought to be at Smyrna. So when the Italians presented a problem, in 1919, and looked like they were going to take Smyrna unilaterally, Venizelos stepped forward and said, "Hey, we can take care of this problem." And of course, Wilson and Lloyd George took him up on it because they didn't want to commit either American or British troops. So it's not as simple, I think, as saying Britain sort of shoved this off on Greece. Greece was a willing participant under Venizelos in the occupation of Smyrna.
There's no doubt about that, of course. Terry, any thoughts on what we're discussing right now, or Stavros after that? Terry? You're mute. Unmute yourself, Terry. Terry, unmute yourself.
Yep, got it. But for a start, one thing that we need to bear in mind is that after the Smyrna landing in May 15, 1919, Mustafa Kemal had landed at Samsun some 4 or 5 days later, with the specific instruction to begin the so-called demobilization of the Eastern Ottoman Army. And then, of course, when he heard what happened in Smyrna, this is time for liberation for the fatherland. And then, of course, they had their congresses at Sivas and Erzurum in July, August 1919, where they hammered out the Turkish National Pact, which in many ways formed the basis of what they would argue in the coming years. And of course, that they also used that in the late 1990, early 1920. They had elections, and the group led by Mustafa Kemal's group, they gained quite a substantial number of seats in the Ottoman parliament, and that should never be forgotten. That the Turkish National Pact was a very important document for the Kemalist movement. Now, the other thing that I found very, very interesting, and some days I forget as well. Oh God, there's so many points have come through. Yes, I actually have a document which actually shows that this is what's called the Foreign Office 608 series. If anyone ever goes to London and goes to the National Archives there, which I've never been, but fortunately I was managed to buy these documents. The Foreign Office 608 series contains all the documents on the British peace delegation to the Paris conference, and you'll find all sorts of weird and wonderful pamphlets by different minority groups arguing that we want this and we want that, as such. And there is in one of the files, they've got a long list of Turks that were arrested, and some were sent off to the island of Malta. And during the First World War, in 1919, there were trials held in Constantinople where certain members of the Young Turks were actually tried and actually hung. And of course, the big three, Jamal and Talat and so on, they escaped. And of course, they were subsequently assassinated in Berlin in 1921. And the people who were the Armenians who assassinated them, they actually got off because they argued that they actually saw their family members being butchered by the Turks in World War One. And one thing that I'd like to say that here in Australia there is actually a great reverence for Mustafa Kemal. You see, every year. Well, because of COVID, we weren't allowed to travel out of Australia for 2 years or so because of COVID. But usually on April 25, Australians will go to Gallipoli to commemorate the Anzac landing in 1915. And, for this country, its identity was built on the shores of Asia Minor, or at least in Gallipoli. And also to the Return Servicemen's League, which represents war veterans. They tend to be, from my dealings with some of these individuals, they seem to be very pro-Turkish. They seem to admire what's called the clean fighting Turk. In fact, the Australians actually referred to the Ottoman troops as Johnny Turk. That's like that. You see, someone mentioned about Chanak, or the just after the defeat of the Greek army. Well, there were Australians at that time in September 1922 were rushing off to enlist to go and fight the Turks, the Kemalists, because some of these troops had been unemployed after the end of the hostility. They were finding it hard to get work, and they were finding it hard to readjust to post-war society. So Australia almost went to war in September, October 1922, as such. And the then Australian government actually commissioned all the ships of the Commonwealth Shipping Line to be used as transports to take the troops and whatever other material to fight at Chanak. But fortunately, cool heads prevailed, and Harrington basically just let matters lapse, and there was no conflict, and that opened the path for the discussions at Mudanya.
Thank you, Stavros. Before we get to Ismini for a second, Stavros, any thoughts on the discussion?
I would just like to add, in regards to when World War I ended, and if there is a Greco-Turk war, I just want to add that it's much easier to sell the idea that Turkey won a Greco-Turk war than that Turkey won the First World War. for Turkey. So it's much easier to sell that image and then for foreign powers to come in and act as honest brokers that will try to mitigate any adversity and so forth. One other thing that I forgot to mention in my presentation, ever since the late 1980s, there is a document, classified document, but it always leaks in Turkish circles, which is called the Red Book. I'm sure everyone has heard of it, which basically this Red Book every year categorizes the threats against Turkey. Kurds and the economy.
What is the Red Book saying now? What is the Red Book, Stavros? What is the Red Book?
It's always the Kurds. It's always the Kurds. Greece is always down the line. It's not what is considered a threat to Turkey. That doesn't mean that Turkish foreign policy doesn't do what it does, but it's not a priority. Greece is not considered a priority as a threat. Kurds and terrorism, ever since the 1980s, will always be the main security threat in Turkey. So taking that into account and adding the Sèvres or Lausanne or whatever syndrome, or another concept which is called siege mentality in Turkey, you can see that it's widely used in Turkish society. Everyone is against us. Here's our yearly list of our threats. We should always be on guard and trust us to do what we need to do. That's why we do coups, 5 coups since the 1960s. There are other failed coups as well that we don't talk about. There's also the online coup, the internet coup of 2007.
Ismini, your thoughts?
Well, I have to say that actually in 1919 and 1920, the Greeks were doing very well. And actually, when they had the upper hand and they were possibly close to finishing the nationalists, they were prohibited by the Allies from doing so. And also, you may be aware that the Greeks were prohibited from searching ships carrying weapons to the nationalists, as well as from occupying Constantinople to force the nationalists to concede defeat. Despite being impoverished, little impoverished Greece, I believe I called Greece, or Hellas, as you prefer saying, Lou, they were encouraged to keep on going by the Allies, but then the Allies started realigning, reevaluating their goals and abandoned Greece and had a big betrayal, stabbed in the back, which incidentally is what the Blight of Asia is really about. The big betrayal of the Greeks by the Allied forces, because that we can believe it, because the Turks, being the Turks, they're going to do what they do anyway. But the Christian allies, to betray Greece that sacrificed so much to be in Asia Minor, and why shouldn't they be near Smyrna when the people in Smyrna and around Smyrna for so long have been abused in so many ways by the Turks? And more than that, there were 3 times more Greeks living in Smyrna than in Athens proper. So why wouldn't they want to go to their fellow Greeks and Christians and support them? But the big betrayal changed everything.
Because it's a different country, Ismini. You know what I mean? This is a classic case of irredentism. You know, Greece was trying to take back something that it had owned 2,000 years earlier.
Right? Well, it's not another country when this country has been vanquished. Well,
let's
don't forget that Turkey was on the losing side and not in a position, or should not be allowed to be in a position to dictate terms.
if I can just jump in here,
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
Treaty of Sèvres was also very close to the manifestation of the Megali there, the great idea that had been part of Greek foreign policy from the 1840s.
Right.
We almost got
Yeah.
very close to achieving something that the Greek politicians dreamed about up until 1920. Then, of course, after Venizelos lost, it ended up in tatters after that. And also, too, what's also very important, that Metaxas actually did say, even in his diaries and memoirs that he wrote, he actually said that if Greece goes into Asia Minor and tries to pursue inland, it's going to be beyond the resources of the country. We're going to be facing a hostile population. He even wrote that, look, in January 1915, when Venizelos was pleading King Constantine to come on board with the Entente, and he said, you know, we've got Asia Minor as our big prize and all this sort of stuff. But Metaxas warned Venizelos that it's not going to be as easy as what you think. You know, we are a small country. We are a small power. There is no way we can conquer this. And in fact, I've seen in the British Foreign Office 406 series, and I think that Paraskevopoulos, who was the commander-in-chief of the Greek army in Asia Minor, because in June, July 1920, remnants of the Kemmelis came pretty close to the shores of Constantinople, but on the Asiatic side, and then the British Navy shelled some of the towns and villages along on the Asiatic shore, and the Greek army pushed the Kemmelis inland, and in fact Paraskevopoulos sent a cable to Venizelos, who was at some conference, I think it was at Hythe, Hythe outside of Paris, whatever it was, and he was asking, this is our opportunity to dismiss them once and for all, you know. But Venizelos was a bit apprehensive and said no, he wasn't quite sure. He didn't want to sort of push the Greek army further and further inland. But even in 1921, when Constantine went to Asia Minor, Metaxas actually sat in on some of these discussions. And he was actually telling him, there's no way we're going to win this war. That the Kemmelis are very, very determined to defeat like that. Even General Gouraud in March in 1921 at the London conference that was intended to modify the Treaty of Sèvres actually said, you think you can defeat the Turks? You're not going to have much hope because they fought very ferociously against us at Adana, Marash in early 1920, and they defeated the French. And of course, a lot of thousands of Armenians were actually slaughtered. And even during the discussions that formed the Treaty of Sèvres, to try to take control of Turkey to make sure it didn't go to war and all that, they're talking about 27 divisions, which were a couple 100,000 men to garrison the whole Ottoman Empire after World War I. But all these things never happened because all these great powers like Britain and France after World War I, they were in the process of demobilization. Their budgets had been blown. They wanted to try and get back to some kind of economic balance, balance the budget.
There's no doubt about that. There was a mention of oil. I think it was you, Lou.
Yeah, right.
Can you just elaborate for our audience a little bit about some of the things that were taking place?
Right. Well, oil at this period was coming into its own as the most important commodity in the world. One of the naval officers, I can't remember who, said that the Allies flowed to victory in World War I on a sea of oil. So Britain and France, of course, were jockeying for the oil fields. And it wasn't clear at that point where all of the oil was. They knew it was in Iraq and in Iran, but it wasn't clear how far west it went. Maybe there was some even in what we now think of Israel. At the time, it was Palestine. And so, Britain and France were jockeying for position there, for concessions. But, in the end, the Americans big-footed all of that. And any attempt by France and France and England to sort of position themselves as having the concessions in those areas simply was not tenable with American power in the area.
Wasn't Wilson? Wilson fell ill at a particular point in time. Does that link at all with the time zones that we're talking about right now?
I'm not familiar with Wilson's views on how that part of the world how the borders should have been drawn. I don't know that he got into it in that kind of detail. Terry, do you know?
Yeah, well, the only thing that I can go offhand now is that he drew the boundaries of this future Armenian state.
I'm aware of that, but Iran and Iraq, those of course are British boundaries.
That's right. Well, Iran was an independent, so-called independent country, but it was
Syria and Iraq. I'm sorry. Yes, right.
Yeah. Well, Iraq. But before that, it was known as Mesopotamia, as such. And look, during the First World War, the area of Mosul, the French wanted that, but somehow Lloyd George was able to cajole his friend Clemenceau to hand Mosul over to the British, and he gave something else in Syria or Lebanon to the French.
Right.
And let's not forget about the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Of course.
Talk about all that.
Yes.
Right.
For the audience, can you just mention a little bit more about that, if you can, Stavros, for the audience?
The Sykes-Picot, it was an agreement between the foreign ministers of Britain and France, which basically said how we're going to divide the Middle East after the war. But that was before Wilson came in. And from what I understand, the last thing that Wilson wanted, regardless of his health issues, was for France and Britain to expand their empires. That's why we don't to expand their empires. That's why we don't have. That's why Palestine was not a British colony; it was a mandate. And because of the mandate statuses of all those regions, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, etc., they had different categorizations. A mandate, B mandate, C mandate, which meant that each region would have a process for future either independence or autonomization. That was the case for the Palestinian territory, the Syrian territory, and the Lebanese territory. And in the case of Mosul, sorry.
No, sorry, what I was going to say.
In the case of Mosul, go ahead, just finish in the case of Mosul.
In the case of Mosul, there was a lot of talks with Turkey. What's going to happen with Mosul? Is it going to be a part of Turkey or not? And it was left for the coming years and for a future referendum, which went against Turkish interests. So Turkey lost whatever claim it had on Mesopotamia. So.
Well, I was just going to add very quickly, after the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres in September of 1920, the Australian government was actually making inquiries as to what trade opportunities could be in the Smyrna region. Australia was basically a primary producer of wool and whatever, wheat and so on. But it was actually making inquiries about trade opportunities, and also even in Mesopotamia at that time. Australia, even though it may have been a small country, it's a big island continent, but it was only about 5 million people. But because it was part of a huge empire, it was looking for trading opportunities, and they're looking in Mesopotamia, they're looking at Smyrna at that time.
I guess everybody was looking to take advantage economically or whatever based on their own interests. We're gonna wrap up this discussion, but what I'd like to do is go panelist by panelist and some final thoughts. We'll start with Terry. Some final thoughts on our panel discussion, or some other things you want to discuss.
I'd just like to say that I'd like to thank the opportunity for speaking and also listening to some excellent comments from my fellow co-panelists. I hope that one of these days that I'd be able to meet you face to face rather than through looking at this screen here. It reminds me of a program which I've seen in America called Hollywood Squares as such. So I really enjoyed the thing, and it's good to exchange information because we learn from each other. You know, the idea that everyone knows everything, we don't. You know, and I'm always on the lookout for new materials to elaborate and embellish my research. Thank you very much.
Terry, we're waiting for you in New York, obviously, and certainly Greece is waiting for you also. Lou, some final thoughts, ideas, concepts?
Terry, it's great to be with all of you, and I'm learning a lot from these sessions. And Lou, I want to especially salute you. You have taken such a leadership role in creating a regular dialogue about these important historical issues, relating them to the present in a way that I have seen no one else do. My hat is off to you, and I really admire the initiative and the achievement that you've had in this regard. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
No, Lou, thank you. The only thing that I regret, Lou, is that you were in Greece and you couldn't come to the concert. Okay, the Hellenic Harlem Blues concert. Okay,
I wanted to be there so much.
It was fantastic. It was really amazing.
I was very torn.
Stavros, some final thoughts? Any other thing you want to mention?
I just want to one final mention on Smyrna. After the 1920s, Smyrna was known in Turkish as Yaul İzmir, which meant treacherous Smyrna. So that added further consolidation with regard to Turkish identity with the other, the foreigner, the non-Turkish.
It's most unfortunate, by the way, that you had a cosmopolitan society. Okay, I think that was mentioned before. You had a cosmopolitan society within Turkey, not only obviously Smyrna, but Constantinople. All these places were cosmopolitan. It's really a shame what took place, and certainly the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that Ismini, basically, not focused on, but basically discussed. It's very unfortunate because, as Ismini indicated, it created a certain acceptance of ethnic cleansing and in fact, an acceptance of genocide. And to this day, it's most unfortunate that it's not recognized. Once we cleanse ourselves and recognize these things, I think it's going to be better for both societies. Ismini, I'm sorry. Did you finish or no? I'm sorry.
I just want to say that at best it was a reaction to other rising nationalism since the 19th century. At worst, it was the worst kind of ethnic homogenization in the 20th century. And also for any of the Greek-speaking audience, you might find my book on Turkish-Israeli relations.
Πες το στα ελληνικά, γιατί βλέπω ελληνικά.
Τουρκία και Ισραήλ στη Μέση Ανατολή. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, it's Τουρκία και Ισραήλ στη Μέση Ανατολή, από το Ψυχρό Πόλεμο μέχρι τη Αραβική Άνοιξη. It's from εκδόσεις Επίκεντρο. It's not a very big book. It's about 350 pages. It's nice. It has the syndromes in it.
I think we have to get it translated into English.
Happily.
Okay.
And I want to thank everyone, Mr. Katsos, my fellow panelists. It was a pleasure to share this panel with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I will see you in Athens in late September. Ismini, some final thoughts, ideas?
Yes, thank you. I thank you and all the fellow co-panelists. I echo everything that Terry and Lou and Stavros shared, and certainly your outstanding efforts to contribute to our knowledge and knowing our true history through events and so many different facets of the Hellenism. So thank you for doing all that so faithfully, so long, and may you do it forever. But my final thoughts first, by the way, I should clarify, because I said nearly in my presentation, no one argues, including myself, that Greece alone could have won. Well, almost nearly, but with the allies certainly could have. But with regards to the Sèvres treaties, the Sèvres Treaty, I believe, highlights just how disastrous the Lausanne Treaty was. And it really also highlights that if we do not punish genocide and other crimes against humanity, we get more of it. So we need to know our history, our true history. We need to share it so we can recognize the signs of something that is about to happen that can be as terrible as the genocide. We do not want to have it happen again, ever. But we need to be aware what the signs are, we need to know our history, and we need to speak up and hold accountable those that should be held accountable. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ismini, and thank you for a fabulous group of panelists that we had today. These particular issues, not many people talk about it, by the way. I think if you ask the common person about this particular treaty, I don't think anybody knows what you're talking about, but I'm glad we were able to have this particular discussion. To the audience, join us on September 15th. Our next event is going to be a panel discussion on the sack of Constantinople and Latin Frankish Hellas, 1204 to 1566. Thank you again for being with us, and thank you again to the panelists for an amazing panel discussion.
Oh, Lou,
Yes.
can I just say something very quickly?
Yes.
I'm also a member of the Australian Institute of Macedonian Studies here in Melbourne, Australia, and
Yes.
I'm actually involved uploading thousands of different newspaper documents and whatever, dealing with Greece, northern Greece, Macedonia, Thraiki, Samothraki, Imvros, Tenedos, and so on. And eventually we want to make this project available to the world. So we are currently working that under Professor Anastasios Tamis. Maybe that's some guy you may want to have a look at. Professor Tamis is a world authority on the Greek diaspora, and he's written over 30 books. So that's someone you may...
Well, I love the ideas because you're always giving me ideas for another panel discussion. So it's always great. Again, thank you. Thank you for being here today. It's been a great panel, and on an amazing topic. And of course, we'll continue to go into these various aspects that nobody talks about. Thank you to the audience, and to our next panel discussion on the sack of Constantinople and Frankish Hellas, which is, again, a period of time that very few people know anything about. They don't know that there were knights of the Moria, for example, and they had jousts, etc., in Corinth, where you're teaching, Stavros. They used to have, jousts, etc. And among the finest French knights were actually the knights of the Moria. Anyway, take care, everyone, and
thank you.
see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks again. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.